I've always been a pretty big fan of the Warframe universe. See, back in the day when Steve Sinclair was creative director, Warframe was a lot more science fiction oriented, with your sleek and shiny designs, laser weapons, robots, spaceships, stuff like that. And honestly, it was pretty creative sci-fi, all things considered. There was, and still is, so much detail and creativity oozing out of each and every facet of design, whether it's individual characters, environments, or ideas. Even the stuff that was more generic had really creative twists, like AI being considered heretical, so cephalons, which basically serve the same purpose, are revealed to be people that had their brains digitized and edited as a form of capital punishment and enslavement. Yeah, pretty rad. But when Steve stepped down as creative director and passed the role on to Rebecca Ford, otherwise known as the Lotus, Warframe's story started to shift largely towards science fantasy as opposed to science fiction. Instead of fighting robots, now we're fighting hyperdimensional god and fictional storybook guys, and there's a spaceship stuck between dimensions and big naked guys. While I'm still a little nostalgic for Warframe's more simple sci-fi days, this shift has allowed the dev team to get really creative in every single department: weapons, enemies, environments, and of course, story. So you're probably wondering why I just went into a 2-minute tangent about Warframe's mild genre shift. And it's because Warframe's lore and story have been difficult to follow at the best of times, and I feel that while recent Warframe quests have killed it in the "holy shit, this is fucking awesome" department, it's been a little hectic. What the hell is Duviri? Why are there 2 of me? What's Eternalism? What's a Strand of Craw? Who are these guys? What's the Unum? What's a Spectre Particle? What are these? Who is that? Why does Ortis have a body now? Why are there pregnant Warframe? The thing is, for some of these questions, there are answers, but you have to go really out of your way to find them, meaning 90% of the player base just won't bother. I'm all for non-linear and non-direct storytelling, but the issue is that there are key things you need to understand how this world functions, but these aren't really given or explained to you in a way that's entirely digestible. This kind of stems from a pretty big issue that's plagued Warframe for a while now, which are content islands. There are plenty of videos that cover the topic, but the gist is that Warframe has an issue of making these massive groundbreaking expansions that just don't really connect to each other or the quote-unquote base game. So for example, most resources or equipment that you might find and use for Railjack pretty much have zero use outside of Railjack, and vice versa for resources or gear you collect and use outside of Railjack, making it feel pretty isolated from the rest of the game. The open worlds are also a pretty good example of this, having exclusive resources or mechanics that just don't affect anything outside of them. This ends up affecting quest design and story structure because oftentimes quests are used to introduce one of these new expansions, meaning most of the story is kind of buried under the tutorial of new mechanics or game modes. This is also why, in my opinion at least, some quests end kind of abruptly, almost unsatisfyingly so, because they're not meant to have actual conclusions, otherwise the core gameplay loop wouldn't have a reason to exist. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because I was super fucking intrigued when 1999 was first announced. I had no clue what the hell they were going to do with this idea, but as more and more information trickled out, I got more and more excited. We've been heading towards this cosmic fantasy god war for a little bit now, and now we're going back to the past, and the Warframes are actual people for some reason, and we got motorcycles. Considering DE operates on the rule of cool, I knew they were going to do some awesome shit with this update, and admittedly, I was hoping we were going to get a fully dedicated story quest, kind of like the Second Dream and the New War, instead of another tutorial. And in a way, DE gave us both. In order to properly explain what I mean, we're going to have to go through the quest. I'm not going to go in depth or anything, just basic overview. I'm assuming you've already played the quest anyway, so in typical Warframe fashion, nothing makes sense.
Marty's legit?
The hell is going on? But that's kind of intentional this time. If you weren't sure what Whispers in the Wall was trying to set up, the absolute bare minimum that you need to know is Albrecht Entrati, this guy, sent himself back in time to 1999 and needs us to join him to do something to help fight the big wall guy. Nobody quite knows what or why yet. If you want to know more, there's a Stalwart video, I'll link it in the description. We play the first missions from the point of view of Arthur Nightingale, the leader of the Hex, which basically comprise of the half-mutated Warframes called Proto-Frames. Through Arthur, we get introduced to the rest of the Hex and witness some surface-level personality traits and group dynamics. It's enough to get you interested, but not enough to actually give anything about them away. The Hex are pretty cool design-wise. I like the fusion of the Warframe and modern military aesthetic. I feel like they clash in a way that kind of works. Arthur traces a trail that he believes is leading to Entrati, who he and the Hex don't seem to be big fans of, but instead it leads him to us. So somehow, we go back by getting vomited up, have a little clash with Arthur, and I think basically transfer all of our memories and stuff into his head on accident. So he and the other guys quickly figure out why we're here without needing to prove ourselves, which is a nice touch. You got a brief glimpse at their characters in the intro as Arthur, but towards you, the Hex are pretty standoffish, which makes sense because you're a time-traveling magic man who just popped out of a zit. But other than Amir and Aoi, their personalities are pretty muted, if they're even expressed at all. But we'll get back to that later, don't worry. Hulvania is probably one of the best looking tile sets in the game, and despite just being a normal European city, it stands out specifically because it's so modern and normal looking. They also got Gordon, so that's cool. But yeah, A+ level design. I just think it was a bit weird to give us motorcycles when the map is pretty tight. Most of your traversal involves a lot of elevation, so the bike just doesn't really work. That, or there are incredibly narrow paths with sharp turns, which, yeah, if you're skilled enough you can navigate with a bike, but you're just gonna have better overall maneuverability with your Warframe anyway. So I don't know, seems a bit counterintuitive, but bikes are cool, and you could use them in almost any mission. You spend most of the quest looking for Albrecht, and it pretty much serves as a tutorial for the Hulvania missions, which are all pretty fun except for this new version of survival. I hate it, I get what they were trying to do, I just don't think it's that fun. I kind of thought Albrecht would be a lot more present for this quest, but we really only interact with him directly like twice. We do learn that the reason we're back in 1999 is to let a nuclear reactor go off and kill everybody for some reason. He kind of brushes it off, but yeah, basically we're here to pretty much sacrifice the Hex.
Do not allow Arthur and the Hex to stop this.
Oh.
I realize what I am asking, but you of
I don't know them that well. I'm kind of okay with screwing them over.
what is
We also get a little bit more of the man in the wall or the Indifference as a character outside of his interactions with us. He's either just a dick all around or seems to really have it out for Albrecht, which is both interesting and makes a lot of sense. Eventually we find Albrecht and he commands us to kill this lady whose name I forgot that the Indifference was possessing. And for some reason our drifter has an issue with killing her despite the fact we killed like at least 100 people like 15 minutes before this.
kill her now.
Yeah, agreed. Why are you hesitating, bro? We've killed like fucking 30 trillion people. No, shoot her in the head. Wait, shoot her, dude. What? I don't care. Doesn't matter because we get zapped back into the Zariman by Wally. Without us there to help, the Hex decide to try and stop the reactor from blowing up on their own, and we're forced to watch each of them die one by one while Wally taunts us. It's a really cool sequence, but the entire time I was watching these people die, I honestly didn't care that much. Like, call me weird, but at the end of the day, I don't know these people. They seem cool, but we really haven't spent that much time with them, so them dying didn't really affect me at all. I was kind of confused as to why they were being killed off so quickly, actually. Anyway, as we watch Quincy, Letty, and Eleanor die, Wally goes on to this really interesting tangent about how the Orkin, and I'm guessing specifically Albrecht, stole a piece of him and maimed him for his power, and he seems pretty pissed about that. Rightfully so. But on the flip side, he talks about how we took his powers with permission, and even though it's never outwardly stated, it does kind of recontextualize a lot of our previous interactions with him. While he's been kind of creepy and ominous, he hasn't been outwardly antagonistic towards us specifically, up until recently, where to be fair, we are kind of working on a way to kill him. It really adds a lot to Wally's character and gives him a lot more depth than I really thought we'd ever get out of him. I kind of like that they managed to find a good mix of eldritch god that towers above you, and a genuine character with his own feelings and motivations. Eventually we get to Aoi, Arthur, and Amir, the last remaining Hex. Aoi gets fucking obliterated because she didn't mod for enough power strength. Arthur proves that the diamond skin mod is actually useful, and Albrecht just fucking shoots Amir, like it's not even fair. And again, I'm left here thinking, what does any of this mean? Why does the reactor need to go off? Why is Albrecht being such an asshole when the whole point of the last quest was about him trying to undo his assholishness? Our drifter isn't really having it either with these vague plans and says that he can save the Hex. Bit late for that, but, and weirdly enough, instead of dropping some like evil ass one-liner about how we're wrong, Albrecht responds with,
Not unless you know them.
and then shoots us in the chest. So I'm just sitting here confused as hell, wondering if like Lloyd is gonna pull us out or something, and then this happens. And then quest over. What the fuck was any of that? I'm not gonna lie to you, I was initially really pissed with this quest. I felt like it embodied every single issue I had with Warframe's quest design. The pacing was all over the place, seemingly ending at the climax. I didn't understand what was happening, and because of that I didn't particularly care about any of it, and the hex felt so wasted, and what the fuck is Albrecht's fucking problem, dude? It just felt incomplete, and that's because it was. I mentioned before that DE often use their quests to introduce new content, and because of that some quests don't have proper conclusions, or at least don't feel very impactful if they do. So DE pulled a genius move and made the quest continue into the actual content itself. So let's go over some of my initial frustrations, starting with the hex. I didn't care about any of them because I didn't know them.
Murmur expelled. Tau is in sight. They've given their lives for this. Make it count.
Just go.
I don't know these people, but that was actually the whole point. That thing that Albrecht said, he was being completely genuine. At the end of the quest, Lloyd tells us that for some reason we've managed to reset the entire year of 1999, I'm assuming thanks to our Duviri powers. The reason for doing so is so that we can develop a bond with the Hex and change the outcome of New Year's Eve, and also so we can run bounties and stuff for gameplay purposes. And this is where I was introduced to one of the best systems Warframe has ever had, the Kim Messenger. Let me explain. See, the Hex are currently up to date on all the stuff that's going down, and will go down on New Year's Eve. Probably through like the same way we psychically trauma dumped on Arthur, so they've all got like a co-worker relationship with you going on. But remember what Albrecht said, we have to know them. So through this little non-Macintosh, you can engage in text conversations with each member of the Hex and get to know them. Each conversation with them builds chemistry, with certain responses netting you some extra depending on how the conversation goes. This system had the potential to be really boring and uninteresting, but the writing absolutely carries it. I'm not kidding when I say I think this is the best character writing in Warframe, period. Each member has their own goals, opinions, hobbies, but most importantly their own way of expressing themselves. As where the Hex in-game were kind of uninteresting, over the Kim Messenger they're a lot more defined. Even just in the way they pick usernames or the way they type, it feels so authentic and unique, and it's such a simple but subtle way to add personality to each character. The actual conversations gave the Hex a lot more depth and really surprised me with how thought out each character was. Amir thinks so much and so fast that he can hardly keep up with his own mind. Quincy is really blunt and takes himself really seriously. Eleanor actually has a pretty great sense of humor and can be really spiritual and introspective. And Arthur and Letty are pretty closed off and can honestly be downright hostile sometimes. But as you talk to these people more and more, not only do you discover more and more about them, but they also start to change based on how you interact with them. You can get Quincy and Arthur comfortable enough to the point where they'll drop the tough guy axe and joke around with you. There were conversations I would have with Eleanor that would get so deep I would genuinely forget that this was not a real person. Aoi, despite being all bubbly and friendly on the surface, is actually incredibly self-aware about how she comes off and how people judge her. She talks a lot about how just because you present yourself a certain way doesn't mean that's all there is to you, and it's important to try and see people for who they really are, not just who you think they are. I remember getting so invested in the story of her and Arthur's breakup and how she learned that even though they cared about each other, she finally saw him for who he really was and had to accept that they could never work romantically. You can even influence certain dynamics between each member. Like, for example, there's some tension between Amir and Quincy, but if you talk and get to know them individually, you learn more about their backgrounds and perspectives and can convince them to talk to each other one-on-one. And even though this happens off-screen, it feels real because both Quincy and Amir will bring it up on their own and continue to mention in future conversations. You can literally branch off into entirely different conversations based off one dialogue choice. And hell, you can even screw things up with certain members. Call Aoi boring and she will make sure you never forget it. Make fun of Arthur or Amir during a vulnerable moment and they will never open up to you again. Insult Letty's religious beliefs? Yeah, you're cooked. Now, I'll admit sometimes this can be a bit frustrating since the tone in certain responses isn't always clear and something you might read as a joke might come off as rude or insulting to the recipient, but I actually kind of like that because that's what happens in real life with real people. And honestly, man, if you choose some of the dialogue options, you low-key deserve the response you get, is all I'm saying. The Hex will also ask you questions about the future and your own personal history, which offers some nice role-playing opportunities. This also gives us some solid hard facts and confirmations about some of the more obscure or unanswered parts of the lore. I love this because it finally strikes that balance of being an indirect way to give the players who care about the universe more lore, while also being a lot more accessible and digestible to the average player. These characters and this messenger system are so deep and so complex, it's just another one of those things that I couldn't imagine being in the game, and here it is, and it's fucking awesome. While I think just the writing alone makes these interactions 1000% worth doing, there is an incentive. You see, with every positive interaction you have with a Hex member, your personal relationship with them grows, and when it reaches the like status with all 6, you can redo New Year's Eve. Now let me clarify, you don't actually need to interact with this system to progress the Hex Syndicate or each member's relationship status. You can go ahead and do bounties around Holvania, and if you do a bounty with a certain member, you'll get some relationship standing with them. You can also buy them gifts, and as your relationship standing increases, you'll get a better idea of what to get them. Doing these two things while also having the text exchanges is obviously the fastest way to progress your relationship, but if you don't want to interact with the messenger for whatever reason, then gifts and bounties are the way to go. You also only need to reach like the 2nd relationship rank with each member, so once you do that, you don't even really have to bother with the system at all if you really don't care for it. So with the stupid little A messenger minigame, DE managed to patch up the largest issue with this quest, which was my indifference, get it, towards the Hex. But still, why are we here? And why did Albrecht seemingly set us up specifically to redo the year and make buddies with the Hex? Once you reach the like status with each individual member, talk to Albrecht's weird fucking cat in the back room and you can redo New Year's Eve. See, if you remember the sacrifice quest all the way back, there were 2 main takeaways. 1. Warframes are mutated people. 2. The process of transference is symbiotic and even therapeutic for both the Tenno and the Warframe. Now that complicates things a bit, because the Hex, while being Warframes, are also still themselves, and like Umbra and the Sacrifice, they're not too keen on letting a whole other dude in their head, especially a stranger. But because this time around we know them and forged a bond with them, we can establish a transference link without being forced out. As you relive the events of New Year's Eve, this time you use this connection to alter the course of events, enhancing the abilities of each member while also offering some emotional support. I remember with each member I saved, I got more and more hyped because I felt like I was actually making some kind of difference in the story, and I actually cared about these people and wanted to see them live. Along the way, the Indifference tries to beat you down and tell you this won't change anything, and the Drifter just responds with,
Then why are you trying so hard to stop me?
Fucking tough, dude. At the very end, when Arthur is keeling over, there's a thick window between him and your Drifter, and like he did the first time around, he insists on you leaving him behind. You learn through conversations with Arthur and from stories the other Hex members share about him that Arthur is a fighter at heart. He spent his whole life sweating and bleeding, believing that he alone must bear the weight of the world so that others won't. Ironically, it's this mindset that damages his relationships and forces him to wall people off. His denial of personal happiness and his savior complex pretty much guarantee this guy is going to go out sacrificing his life in some way, but not today. You've earned his trust. You've shown him that he doesn't have to give up everything and everyone to win, and in fact, his greatest strength comes from the people who are always willing to fight alongside him, you included. The glass between you and him serves as a barrier between you two, but the transparency acts as an invitation for communication. While still a barrier, it's one that's significantly less solitary than a literal wall. Because of you, Arthur has a newfound sense of trust and maybe even hope he didn't before, allowing him to reserve a medium through which you can reach out, transferring through the glass and giving him the strength to stand and save himself while this amazing rendition of a 1999 inspired This Is What You Are fires through the speakers. While this is happening, Albrecht explains that the reason he did all of this, the reason he sent us back to 1999, was because we needed to learn how to let others into our hearts.
Your heart would struggle to move them. It had to grow. The only way it ever does. With others. Carry this power with mercy, Tenno.
One of the most beautiful moments in the game happens during the Whispers in the Wall quest, and it's the scene just before the quest concludes where Albrecht confesses how much he loved Lloyd and how he was never worthy of him, and it was this single act of love that clued us in on how to beat the Indifference. No bullets, no blades, just a gentle touch, mirroring the final gesture shared by Albrecht and Lloyd. Albrecht Entrati, despite mostly being in the background until now, is a key player in the Warframe universe. He's the one who both revolutionized void-based travel while also being the person to discover the Man in the Wall. Albrecht dedicated the rest of his life to finding a way to defeat or at least contain the Man in the Wall, and this fight against the Great Indifference ironically made him indifferent to the world around him. He neglected his wife and daughter, he walled off the one person who loyally stood by him through everything, he tortured and experimented on innocent animals, and he mutated the Hex, completely tuning himself out of compassion because what did compassion matter in the face of a threat like this? This apathy spread to the people closest to him. His daughter neglected her own family in pursuit of her father's approval. Lloyd is left bitter and alone to deal with the aftermath of his greatest love abandoning him. The Kavia were given the curse of sapience just so they could realize how little they mattered. Even Arthur, although not for the same reasons, parallels Albrecht, believing that neglecting those around him is a worthy price to pay for the greater good. Through Lloyd, however, Albrecht rediscovered the reason his fight even mattered in the first place. Every part of the Kalimos sequence has been an attempt to heal those he hurt in his pursuit of the Indifference. He left Lloyd with the message he needed and deserved to hear his entire servitude. He let the Kavia live because he knew Lloyd could find a way to save them. And he led us to Arthur and the rest of the Hex because he knew that we could open their eyes in the same way Lloyd opened his. The Tenno themselves already have a history of showing compassion for damaged people, whether it's the Warframes, the Lotus, or even Ortis. But that's exactly why Albrecht chose us to go back and extend this mercy, as he calls it, not only to the Hex, but to ourselves. Our Drifter is someone who spent lifetimes alone, reliving the same days over and over again to the point where they grew numb even to dying. It wasn't until they were given a figurative and literal hand that they broke free of their hellish cycle. And while this finally led our Drifter out of Duviri, Albrecht knew better than anyone that they needed more than just a way out of the cycle. They needed a reason to stay out. Even though it's cheesy, it works so well because you actually felt the change from being kind of indifferent towards these people to actively wanting to save them because they matter to you. Your heart, yours, actually changed and grew, and that's why this quest, in my opinion, absolutely sticks the landing. We get a little post-credit scene where we use one of the big naked dudes to let Lloyd know that everything is all good back in 1999. What this means in terms of our next steps is still unclear, but I'm super excited regardless. I honestly really hated the 1999 quest at first, for the reasons I mentioned before, but DE finally found a way to make their quest design work with their gameplay loop, and as a result, we've got this heartfelt story of a man trying to undo all the damage he caused while teaching us to avoid the same mistakes he made. I think this theme of love being the greatest weapon against an entity literally embodying the meaning of indifference, while cheesy, is honestly just so refreshing. It makes me feel powerful for the simple act of exhibiting humanity in the form of love, a love that is only present through humankind, sorry Kavia, due to our extended capability for connection. This is what makes indifference all the more profound because human love is so natural that the lack thereof is tragic. To me, that's what 1999 and maybe Warframe as a whole is about. Tether yourself to the people and things you love. Don't choose indifference as the response to hardship and cruelty. Instead, let your heart grow the only way it ever does, with others.